Thanks, Alois, and hi, everyone. I'm Margot Conahan, ACRL's Manager of Professional Development. Thanks for joining us for today's ACRL Presents webcast, Lies, Damn Lies, and News. How do today's students stay informed, and what can librarians learn from them? As a reminder, today's session is being recorded, and we'll share out the link to the recording shortly after today's session. Our presenters today are Kirsten Hostetler and Margie McMillan. Kirsten is a research analyst and survey manager for Project Information Literacy's news study, How Students Engage with News. She has worked with PIL since 2013 and also served as the associate director of the Lifelong Learning Study in 2016. She's worked in both public and academic libraries and is currently pursuing her PhD in Instructional Design and Technology from Old Dominion University. She's the Instruction and Outreach Faculty Librarian at Central Oregon Community College in Bend, Oregon. Margie is a senior researcher with Project Information Literacy and a co-author of the news study report, How Students Engage with News: 6 Takeaways for Educators, Journalists, and Librarians. She recently retired as a professor and librarian from Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. And Kirsten and Margie, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Margot. I'm going to start off with just a welcome to the webinar on the Project Information Literacy News Study. I'm Margie, just so you know what my voice sounds like, and I'm really happy to be speaking today on a project that brings together 2 loves, journalism and information literacy, and a great team to work with. And speaking of great team,
sorry, I didn't hit the slide. So that was Margie's intro slide, and here's mine. Yeah, yeah, I'm really excited to be presenting this. This has been a long time in the making of working on this study. I'm really excited to share some of the results with all of you today and to kind of get a feel for what we have in store for you. We want to give you an overview of the results of PIL's most recent national study so that you can better understand the news engagement habits of our students based on the findings from the study. We want to see how you can actually apply those findings in your library so that you can help strengthen students' news literacy for academic, personal, and workplace needs. We're also going to cover how you can partner with key organizations so that you can lead efforts without feeling like you're doing all of this work all on your own. And so I also wanted to make sure that the hashtag PIL News is out there. That is part of an ongoing conversation about our study and the results, but we're taking it over for today's presentation. So feel free to ask questions or put comments in that hashtag. We're going to try to be monitoring it as the webinar progresses. So to get started covering PIL's findings, I'm going to turn it over back to Margie.
Thanks, Kirsten. So we started with some basic questions. We really wanted to know how students were engaging with news and where they found it, how it found them, what they did with it, why they used it, and what values they have for news. And it resolved itself down to these 3 basic questions. How do they define news? What do they think of as news? How do they interact with the news on social media? And as it turns out through our study results elsewhere, and how do they determine the currency and the authority of news? So that age-old information literacy question, how do they know if it's any good? In order to do this, we embarked on a very ambitious methodology, the kind of thing that Project Information Literacy is really, really good at. A mix of quantitative and qualitative data. We had 5844 responses to our survey from 11 institutions. We chose those institutions from a pool that volunteers, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide. We had 37 follow-up interviews. We used Twitter handles that were volunteered by over 700 of our survey participants. So we asked them, can we follow you? Can we have a look at your Twitter activity? And that was just a way of testing the difference between, or if there were differences between reported behaviors and actual behaviors. So it's a really nice backup. And in turn, we were able to reference that data against a much larger set from an existing Twitter study. In terms of where we access these students, if you look at the institutional sample, we went for a mix of political diversity, especially charged in this era. We looked for different types of institutions, whether they were R1s or community colleges, PIL is very good about looking at not just the R1s because we know that experiences differ across the spectrum. And we looked specifically for some ethnic diversity as well. We had a community college with 37% Black students, a Hispanic serving institute, a sanctuary school, and 3 other schools in our survey were seeking sanctuary status. So we looked for as much diversity as we could, at least to draw from the pool. And when we went through the data, I have to tell you, this is one of the most fascinating exercises of my entire life. Fascinating, fascinating. The information that students provided, both in their responses to the survey and also in their responses to some free text question and to the interviews, was amazing. It's so rich. It's going to take us a couple of years to actually tease all of the meaning out of the data. And fortunately, I should say at this point, we've made the data open access. All of the qualitative data is open access on the PIL site and in a few other locations just to be safe. And so we're looking forward to what other people draw from the data and report on the data, as well as what we find. So, finding number 1. Students are not newsless. This is contrary to the popular narrative that today's millennials don't care, they're just playing games on their cell phones or following Kardashian news. Our students were far from newsless. Most of them, around 2/3, got their news from 5 different, what we're calling pathways on a weekly basis. And those pathways included discussions with peers at the very top of the list. So those discussions with peers were very, very important. The social aspect of news came through loud and clear in the results of our study. Certainly social media was there, but also discussions with professors. So the importance of getting news through discussion, whether with peers or professors, was particularly high and particularly notable in this study. And I think we asked questions in a way that got at things that other surveys haven't. The other one that we've circled on this is podcasts. And podcasts were really interesting. Students were using those as depth, as a way of finding the story behind the story and a way of building context. And we initially thought that number was quite low until we started looking at other surveys of podcast use. And it's actually higher than most. So it's an interesting trend that I think bears watching. The kind of news that they follow is also interesting. That's another one of our takeaways. So they're selectively following, and they follow, you can imagine, news that they need. So traffic and weather. It's nice to know what coat to wear or whether not to wear a coat, as many of the students that I've encountered do in -20 in Calgary weather. And they tend to be the top of mind, what we think of as the functional, breaking, or hard news. So political news was right up there. And it's interesting to know that political news following is higher than some surveys that were done 2 and 3 years ago. So there's been, we think, an increase perhaps in attention to national and political news. I should also say that when we dove a little bit deeper into the data, there were variations by major. So education majors tended to follow education news a bit higher. Science majors tended to have higher numbers for science news and so on. If you're looking very closely, you'll see that sports is pretty low on the list. And that was an interesting finding that we dove into a little bit in the interview data. We wanted to know why. One of the reasons for sure is survey demographics. Like most surveys of students, we had much higher representation of females than males. And as most surveys will tell you, much higher engagement with sports news among males. But there were also other factors, and one of the comments that sticks with me is the student who said, well, I only follow the playoffs. I have limited time. I'm only going to follow the sports when it counts. And so I think that kind of gives us an insight into how selectively our students are following news. They're busy, but news is important. So they choose what kinds of news they're going to follow and where they're going to get it from. And it's important for school, but it's also important to social capital, and that comes out as we go through. So news is necessary and relentless. And if you look at the 3 that we've hired particularly, the good news is that students think of it as critical in a democracy. Yay! And we're very heartened to see that. You'll also see that they find it's overwhelming. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because I'm not surprised in a moment. Also that there's trust issues, and that the overwhelming amount of what they're seeing as fake news, and I think also the dialogue about fake news in the media and perhaps from their professors is creating that feeling that news in and of itself isn't trustworthy. If so much of it is fake news, can you trust any of the news? And that certainly was a factor with many of our students. It's overlapping in their trust. And I want to bring that into dialogue with the news is work and not leisure slide. So the students are doing things with news. We ask them, what do you do before you share a news item? And a lot of them do things that, frankly, I do not. I have to say, I do not read the whole article all the time before I share it. One of the things that came up in both this data and more particularly in the comments was how much the students read laterally. So students are seeing a news story and reading it in multiple sites for verification. Some of them explicitly said that they look for things like red feed, blue feed to see a different political perspective on it. Some comments said that they look for news from the country of the story to get a different read on it. A lot of them said looking for different perspectives, balancing things like CNN and Fox. And if you think about it, this just compounds the overwhelming nature, right? Because if all you needed for a news story was just the one story, that's easy. But if every news story that is interesting or that you think is critical needs you to read 2 or 3 or 4 other stories, then it snowballs. When I think about how I got news, first of all, I didn't have to check it. This was back in the dark ages. There was one television in residence. And I got to tell you, it wasn't often tuned to the news, but I might hear it from the radio when I turned the radio on. I might read it in a newspaper if I picked the newspaper up at lunch. I might see it on TV if it happened to be on while I was walking past it. I was thinking that I was getting the full story. I wasn't, of course. But news happened when I chose. And I got it in small, very controlled doses. And news today for our students, if you look at how much they're getting it from 5 vectors a week, many times a day in many cases, and they're looking at it across multiple sources. For them, it's a 24/7 IV drip. It's constant. And I really want to say that I'm not surprised by the overwhelming. If anything, I'm surprised it's not higher, because frankly, I'm overwhelmed now by news in my life. And the final finding is probably the one that is going to be the most tangibly useful, I think, and immediately useful in information literacy. And that's the real differences between academic and personal news habits. And so wide vectors. We might like to think that there's a lot of transfer between how we teach, what we teach in the classroom, and what their practices for everyday life information literacy are, but wide variety of what they use for school versus what they use for their personal lives. And I'm nothing here that's too surprising, but I want to unpick a few things. From the comments that we got, a lot of students said they're not allowed to use news, or they're only allowed to use news from certain vetted sources. Students didn't always agree with the prof's judgment on what those sources should be, but would use them because otherwise they don't get the marks. So this is where there was a lot of very strategic use of the news in terms of their academic lives, is that they would only use certain kinds of news from certain kinds of sources because that's what pleased the prof to a large extent, which I think we need to think about for a little. There was also some ease of use factor. They would only use the databases if they had to for academic use because they were more difficult than Google. One of the places where there was considerable crossover was actually news from the prof. I was surprised by the 38% found recommendations from the prof useful outside the classroom. And I think that's really interesting. And finally, in the comments especially, there was a lot of the library databases as being a proxy for reliability, so that anything that they got from a library database was automatically more reliable than anything they could get anywhere else, just by virtue of being in a library database. Now, those of us who play in library databases for a living know that that might not be quite as direct a line as our students might think. But again, I think some of this comes back to how we talk about information literacy, how we talk about information literacy in news, and what we don't talk about. But to explore that, I'm going to turn it over to Kirsten.
Thanks, Margie. Yeah, so now we get to the what I think is the fun stuff, is what all of this means in practice. One of my favorite things about PIL studies and being involved in PIL studies, but also reading the report of our studies, is that we always include some type of practical recommendations, so these key takeaways and things like that. And with this particular report, we didn't just have the recommendations and the takeaways, we also met with leading thinkers in education, in libraries, in media, research, journalism, and we kind of got them all together to discuss that way forward, what all of this means, and how we can take this from the research of the report into our everyday practice. So because I want to focus on how this manifests itself in the classroom, we do have a couple questions to try to engage you guys, just to see how your students are currently interacting or not interacting with news. So we have 3 poll questions. This is the one right now, and we have 2 a little bit more later that will pop up on your screen. So feel free to share your responses on Twitter using that hashtag PIL News. But Elois, if you wanted to go ahead and do the first, yeah, there it goes. So do you already advertise your newspaper offerings to students? This is, you know, basically, are you doing any advertising to push for news specific databases? Are you throwing any of your instructional weight behind your newspaper databases by discussing news as a valid source type and its various forms in your instructional sessions? One of these, all of the above, you could answer yes or no, not as much as you would like. So I'll give you guys a second to add that. I see some people are asking questions already on the Twitter feed, and I think we'll probably get to that at the end, but thank you for asking. And then our results should pop up. There it is. Okay, so it's a bit of a 50-50 split. Interesting. I wanted to ask this question with absolutely no expectations for what your answers might be, to get at something that I think about a lot, particularly after being involved in this study, something that I think a lot about in regard to my news and how libraries, my library in Oregon presents news to students. So for instance, oh, did the results not pop up to everyone? Oh. I'm sorry, it's a 50-50 split. Sorry if you're not seeing the actual results, but it was a 50-50 split. Okay, so at my community college, what we do is actually the search bar on our homepage defaults searches and filters out news, so that they're only receiving peer-reviewed sources in their search results. So I looked at this study and I started to think about what message that sends to students as they kind of look at news sources and what they're actually using in their everyday lives versus what the sources the library tells them are important for their schoolwork. So this brings me to kind of the first instructional implication with multimodal sources. These are sources that students are already interacting with. Multimodal has become a big trend within writing departments in Oregon, probably across the country, because it is shown to be an effective strategy in engaging students through sense making in the various formats that they engage with. I also like multimodal because it really does validate what students are already doing, how they're already interacting with information. Respondents in our survey repeatedly demonstrated they came across news through various pathways. So through social interactions with faculty and peers, like Margie was talking about, through various platforms, primarily through social media, like the 71% who use Facebook, but also that we're starting to see respondents drawn to more visual narratives over text-based narratives, using platforms like Snapchat, YouTube, and Instagram were big platforms that were interesting to see that those were sources of news for our respondents. So assignments that encourage students to engage with information in ways that they already are could combine that kind of natural habit with this research-based trend to more visual or auditory sources. So for instance, having students become content creators by making videos or podcasts could take advantage of this multimodal strategy. In my library credit class at my college, I have students fact check memes as their final assignment so that they're seeing realistic applications of information literacy using the formats that they're already familiar with, that they're already encountering on an everyday life, so that they're becoming more critical of those formats that they're seeing probably more often than journal articles when they're out there getting their news sources. Another one of the instructional implications, so one of the recommendations in the report was to embrace new forms of storytelling with kind of that multimodal aspect. And I could see embracing storytelling more generally in the classroom as another way of encouraging students to view news as an academically acceptable source. So I see storytelling, particularly in my studies in instructional design, is a really powerful instructional strategy. It helps encode new information and it helps learners make these meaningful connections to their past experiences. And news follows a pretty standard storytelling arc. So reading news in the classroom can help engage students with the stories, with kind of the subjects that they're discussing in the class and realistic applications, and make those connections to more abstract concepts that might be difficult to grasp when they don't have that context of the narrative structure. Storytelling can give subjects discussed in class a purpose. It can make it relevant and relatable. It's clear and understandable, particularly in a community college setting that I work in. For many students, it's easier and more accessible language. It incorporates multimodal elements, so you have graphs and pictures. You can listen to podcasts for that depth. And it does challenge learners to make sense of all these connections. That's kind of the benefit of storytelling, but also of that multimodal aspect. So asking students to write for a news audience or even just read news in the classroom as a way to show class concepts and practice can help kind of incorporate these storytelling elements for effective instructional strategies. And I also really like what the science major said in a follow-up interview. The quote goes, "The news makes people talk about what's going on in life, and even fake news creates conversations. Talking is the hallmark of democracy, and the news makes people talk about important issues. Who would speak for the community and marginalized groups if the news wasn't present? People should follow the news. They should know what is going on in the world." So I like that quote. That student perfectly summed up that power of storytelling in news for me. So news has the potential to reflect a student's real life experiences or help them gain insights into other people's experiences. So reading that news and creating assignments that ask them to consider that newsy audience can help students better understand the journalistic standards that go into writing a story to help kind of develop that critical assessment of how news is created, but also can help create a classroom culture that values students' voices and participation, which reinforces that role as a co-creator of news, a critic of news, particularly as engaged citizens who might want to add their voices to larger world issues. And I also like to use the journalistic storytelling narrative as a metaphor for the mindset that you need when conducting research. So journalists can't approach a story with that predetermined idea of what the outcome is. They have to let their sources lead them to other sources and lead them to other sources, which fills in that picture of what happened. So in the full report, if you read it, one of the leading thinkers, Brian E. Swire Thompson, spoke about how inaccurate information is everywhere, and it's really hard that once you encounter that misinformation to correct that misperception. So I like providing this kind of situational context to frame assignments, to frame research assignments, so that students better understand that definition of research as that critical process of inquiry, so that they're not just coming into a piece of misinformation and not doing that lateral evaluation where they can move past it. It's not a linear process, right? You have to kind of move on and let your source lead you to your next source so that you can correct that perception and encounter a lot of different types of information. Which leads me to evaluation. We saw this chart before with Margie's slides, and when I look at it, I immediately see some good news and some bad news. The good news is that we're doing a good job of teaching students that they need to evaluate sources for their academic use. We've really drilled that point home. They're coming up with good standards. They're applying this in the classroom. The bad news, of course, is that students aren't typically transferring these evaluation skills to how they use news for non-academic purposes. So in their everyday personal lives, students are gravitating toward these more non-traditional sources that we don't teach in the classroom. And as to be expected, students aren't going to library databases to find what they're curious about, since they encounter them in places on the internet that they're already drawn to, which isn't usually the library website, and sometimes pops up just on their phone, or kind of they don't even have to pursue it. It kind of pops up for them. So when hearing from students, they said things like, course news almost always has to be peer reviewed. And particularly for me, in a community college environment where a lot of students are starting in developmental classes, hearing that their only criteria for evaluation in school is that a source is peer reviewed, I think is doing a disservice to the students who probably find that those sources are not accessible to them, but also not appropriate for their assignments or topics in a lot of their classes. Plus, it indicates to me that a student isn't always thinking critically if the only indicator they're looking for quality is peer review. If we're asking students to blindly only look for peer-reviewed sources without acknowledging that weakness in the system, students' evaluation skills will have a significant gap. Margie, did you want to make a comment?
I just want to say that I saw this over and over again in the comments, and it's sort of overzealous application of what we've taught them. And Kirsten's probably going to go into this a bit more, but we also saw comments like, I look for news from .edu and .gov sources. And so you can see that some of the things that we're teaching them really aren't helping them evaluate news, because if you're looking for peer-reviewed news, it's going to be tough.
Yeah, when Margie and I were talking about our slides the other day, I told her about an email I got from a student that said, well, I found it was a video from Films on Demand. And they said, well, I found it on the library website, so it's peer reviewed, which is kind of missing the point of what that means. But we've drilled this point of peer reviewed. Maybe we have, maybe faculty have, but that's the be all end all of evaluation. And again, that's leaving them with a significant gap in their knowledge of that they can apply this outside of the classroom. So another student, the next quote says, I don't trust news anymore. It fills an agenda. It always fills an agenda. That's a fact. And this, of course, is a current perception that we're dealing with. And trust me, I hate saying this phrase as much as I'm sure you hate hearing it, but fake news, which we can't control, but we can start discussing the value of the news in the classroom so that students' perceptions can start to include news as an equally academically acceptable source as a journal article, which kind of might help make that transfer between academic and personal habits. And I liked the comments from one of the leading thinkers included in the report, Catherine D'Annunzio, who suggested that we stop legitimizing this framework and label this perception of fake news what it is, which is propaganda and media manipulation. So reframing it in those terms can help students recognize fake news and that shift their perceived bias inherent to all media to just another part of the students' evaluation techniques, where they're detecting propaganda as one of the various source types that they'll encounter that they'll have to sift through. And this means in the classroom, we should be focusing on teaching students about sources. So locating the origins of stories and recognizing news in different environments to meet students where they are, which is on BuzzFeed and Reddit, not just traditional outlets like the New York Times. And with far fewer getting news from print sources, like I think it was about 33% of our respondents said they were still getting news from print sources. We're talking about sources also means talking about the context of those sources. So the idea that a newspaper article on the front page is vastly different from a newspaper article on the opinion page, which is vastly different from native advertising that looks like a newspaper article that appears on a newspaper website. It's really hard to tell the difference when you're online or when you're clicking on that link from Facebook, to know where it's located in the newspaper without that physical newspaper there to kind of give you that guidance. So talking about that context. And similarly, we talked about Facebook being 71% of respondents encountering news on a weekly basis via Facebook. And these are largely dictated by algorithms. So talking about algorithms in our classrooms, data scientist Kathy O'Neill said, algorithms are opinions embedded in code. So we talked to them about bias in newspapers and bias in sources, but are we mentioning these kind of hidden black box features as to why certain stories pop up over others as important part of that context of, you know, equally as important to the context of evaluating a source as who the publisher is or who the author is. So they're the evaluation techniques that don't fit nicely into the CRAP rubric that many of us probably teach. So we need to get more comfortable with expanding what these traditional evaluation standards are to reflect this much more complex landscape that students are working in. And I find that last quote really interesting. I'm less critical of the facts when I'm getting news for my personal life, because if I make a mistake when communicating, it has less consequences than if I make a mistake while writing academically. And I keep coming back to my community college environment, but it's because they are very close to the workforce a lot of the times. And I've heard this in various iterations from my students, and I'm talking to nursing students, computer science students, early childhood ed students who are about to enter the workforce, and I ask, what consequences happen when you're not in the classroom, but you're trying to keep up to date on the latest practices in your field? What happens when you make a mistake then? Talking about larger consequences in this process of kind of lifelong learning, what happens when you're in a democracy and you're trying to figure out what that latest ballot measure actually means beyond what you're hearing on the news? So all of these things are real consequences outside of the classroom that we can start modeling these skills, not just as academic, but making our processes visible as librarians or as faculty for staying up to date in your field, for how you get news, so that students realize that this effort is not just limited to finding sources for assignments, which I think, like I mentioned, lifelong learning, so it segues nicely into the last instructional implication I have of teaching beyond the academy. And this is one of my own personal pet projects, thinking about how we prepare students for life after college, where knowing how to navigate EBSCO and ProQuest databases is nice, but it doesn't really serve them once they no longer have access to these paywalled resources and they want to stay engaged with information. So are we promoting lifelong learning in our instruction, or just happening to help students survive their research assignments? And I feel like this kind of touches in our news study, but it also fits under a previous PIL study on lifelong learning. So I won't get too far into that, but this student's quote from the write-in response stood out to me. Often for school assignments, I use library databases to find news stories, and for personal use, I tend to go to the less time-consuming way and just use what is right in front of me, such as social media and news apps. So again, the strategies we're teaching for classroom use aren't making that transfer to personal lives because it's seen as onerous. It's seen as not worth the effort that you might want to get an A, but you don't have anyone checking to make sure you get an A on your vote or whatever. But as we just discussed, making that connection to students' lives outside of the classroom through use of news in the classroom can make those kind of classroom activities more relevant and help reinforce that idea that these strategies and news has a role to play in academia as well as once they leave us. So additionally, several of the key thinkers like Barbara Pfister and Kai Kawashima Ginsburg discussed how our unique position can help cultivate the curiosity and engagement that with the world around them to help prepare students as informed citizens. So this is a time where we have access to these students before they go out and start using news to make these larger decisions. So talking about evaluation strategies, but also, and I'm quoting Barbara's report now, by reorienting library programs from focusing on how an academic library works to how information works in and on society. So instructional strategies like problem-based learning, more experiential learning opportunities can help make these lessons more relevant to students' lives. And also going back to how we market and teach our databases, how much are we encouraging students to view news on the same level as other library sources? Giving students the opportunity to practice that reading, evaluating, and using news in the classroom will increase that likelihood that they will continue to read, evaluate, and use news outside of the classroom. So that takes us to how we can set ourselves up as leaders on campus to advocate for this change without putting all of the work on us. So Margie and I are going to discuss some of these partnerships that might help. But first we have the last of the two poll questions are left. Again, hopefully these questions will pop up on your screen and you can answer or participate at the hashtag PIL News. So we want to hear if you found instructors who require peer-reviewed sources regardless of appropriateness to the assignment or topic. So maybe instructors tell students that peer-reviewed sources are the only acceptable sources in college. I want to know if this is a common practice on your class. So go ahead and hopefully the poll has popped up. Depends on the course student needs. Oh, there's some really good comments coming in on the Twitter feed. Okay, do people see these results? So yes, 80% of you guys found that instructors require peer-reviewed sources regardless of the appropriateness then to the assignment or topic. I like the more often than I'd like. Yeah, that tends to happen. One last question. Conversely, do you have any instructors on campus who are already encouraging use of news in the classroom through class assignments, through projects, through activities? So last poll pop-up. Okay, let's see. Do we have results for that one? So people, yeah, so 77% said yes, they already are instructors who are, they may not send students to libraries to find those sources, but they're already encouraging newspaper use in the classroom, which is a good point from the comments. And I think both of those questions really highlight, underline, bold, exclamation mark, asterisk, the importance of connecting with faculty to develop these partnerships. I'm sure for most of you, this is already a significant part of your job, as it is for me. And if you're like me, it's a struggle to get faculty on board to come up with these changes, to go beyond kind of their traditional standards, the things that they're used to, not recognizing the shift in the information landscape. And so I typically have faculty sing the praises of libraries constantly, but when it comes to following through on kind of making these changes or openness to my suggestions for making these changes, that's where we really have to develop those relationships and that trust. So looking at the survey respondents, 70% of whom received news from professors in the last week, librarians were not even close to this consequential in students' news pathways, with only 7% of respondents saying they received news from librarians in the last week, which I was actually surprised at 7%, but it was clearly demonstrating that, you know, students have more of an interaction on a day-to-day basis with faculty more than they do with librarians, but it also demonstrates that faculty continue to be a major influence in how students view information. I think a lot of times I talk to faculty about this finding and they say, oh, I didn't think my students actually listened to me. But that's reinforced with this quote from a first-year student in a follow-up interview. I just recently found out that news can be fake. You really have to look for credible sources. I've had a lot of assignments where we've had to look for where sources come from. So that's helped me learn a lot and be less naive about the news. Professors have taught me how you have to read through the whole article, look at the source, see where your news is coming from before you make any assumptions. So I'm seeing it becoming more of a habit for me. So we can see that these strategies can work if faculty are aware of these changes and faculty are kind of buying in to the fact that there's a difference between finding information now and allowing for some of these sources to be acceptable in the classroom. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir that these relationships are really important, but it's also interesting to note who the students were that were more likely to receive news via faculty. And that was largely dictated by a student's course of study. Arts and humanities being the area where most students, more than 3/4, said they learn about news through interaction with their peers. Near the top were other social and behavioral sciences, education, I think both of them had about 76%, business with 74%. The majors that were less likely to get news via faculty were in STEM subjects, such as computer science at 51%, engineering and architecture at 49%, or math at 43%. And I find that STEM subjects are where news literacy is becoming more and more important beyond the academy, because I'm sure we've all seen the studies where the latest research reveals eating chocolate and drinking wine is a surefire way to cure cancer or something along those lines. That's what my local news told me. But so when it comes to these instructional implications, STEM faculty using news in the classroom can help embrace that storytelling to make the content more relatable and relevant to their everyday lives. It can help update the evaluation standards, so students are becoming more critical of that research being covered in popular media, and they can help stay up to date in areas beyond the academy. So when developing these partnerships with faculty, thinking of being strategic in which departments you're directing your attention so that you can boost STEM disciplines' use of news as acceptable sources or the basis of class activities and things like that. So additional partnerships that might already be on your radar include public libraries and local high schools. The public library, so at the beginning, Margot said, I work in a community college setting, but just for fun, I also like to work at my local public library in my county once a month. So, and it can be a really excellent resource to introduce students as a replacement post-college, recognizing that interlibrary loan is definitely still a thing in public libraries. Once you leave, reference services don't disappear, this access to information doesn't disappear, and it can help ease that transition from school to beyond. I recommend introducing this partnership early and often in a student's time at school so that they view the public library as a feasible option after graduation. I think some easy options, so I made in my kind of connection to the public library where I live, we kind of help develop a policy where residency requirements are lifted if they have a student ID. So talking to your public library about getting someone to come up and sign students up for library cards on campus can help kind of ease that barrier to accessing that information. Seeing if the public library has any collections gaps or kind of fill in your collections gaps to popular media sources. So I know that our public library has access to several newspapers that we don't provide because they're more popular sources than what we offer here. And then high schools are often overlooked as partners, but they can act as that local pipeline of next year's freshmen. So often working with already strained teachers in the high schools, we had our high school, one of our high schools closed down their library last year. It was very depressing. And I reached out and they were, you know, I can help where I can. And I see those students this year after I was helping with last year, and they're actually coming to me and talking to me and feel more comfortable kind of saying hi or asking questions. So in the report, we talk about working with high schools to teach and work on knowledge and action skills, which is a concept that we defined in the report as supporting both the skills to examine questions, but also a deeper set of mental habits and intellectual frameworks that can guide efficient credibility testing and evaluation for a wide variety of topics. This goal is ultimately to get these skills up to internet speed, because that's how they're interacting with information. So the earlier you introduce these techniques to students by connecting with high schools and discussing these strategies, the more likely that they'll be more natural part of the process by the time students get to you. And I'm going to turn it back over to Margie for the SOTL partnership.
Well, I'm going to talk about SOTL in a second, but there are group of partnerships that it's occurred to me as we talk about this. We met with some leaders in communication scholarship and in education in Harvard, and you'll find the recommendations from these leaders at the end of the report. But a lot of them said we've got to start in elementary school. And even earlier, we have to start with parents. And thinking about public libraries and nonprofit organizations, even PBS has a really strong news literacy component as part of it and does workshops. And so thinking about those partnerships with other areas of libraries, but also beyond the library world, and thinking of that. And within your own institutions of higher education, thinking about who you can partner with. So some of you may know about the Writing Across the Academy, Writing Across the Curriculum, Writing Across Courses, WAC is how it's usually abbreviated, which I think is unfortunate. But why not have a news across the curriculum? Why not think about more deliberately integrating news? Because one of the things the comments showed was how haphazard it was. News just might come up in a class. And so if maybe we could be more deliberate in how we integrate news across the curriculum, that might be a place where the library can play a leadership role in bringing faculty together to talk about the news and think about more deliberate integration. And one of the ways of convincing them is SOTL. And yeah, I know, I like SOTL. I'm a big fan of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning because it's a way in. So where I see Scholarship of Teaching and Learning fitting in with the news is, number one, there are tons of great studies out there, SOTL studies, on how using news improves aspects of learning, aspects of motivation, aspects of connection in the service learning areas and in other learning areas. And so that may be a way of helping faculty understand, by reading the work by other faculty, the role that news could play in their classrooms and the role that libraries could have. It's also a really fertile ground for doing your own SOTL research. So if you want to integrate news in a meaningful way in your information literacy or in your other classes, then think about doing it as part of a SOTL project and getting that information out to a wider audience, both of librarians and of non-librarians. So it's a great place to read for information about ideas for integrating news, but it's also a great place to contribute to the literature and to, again, position the library as leaders in this, because I think we can be. We don't have to be. We are not the only ones. We are not the one bulwark against the tide of misinformation, standing alone with our little lights of wisdom, but we can be a big part of increasing understanding about news and the role that it has in society and the impact that it has on our students. End of rant.
So I think, yeah, I think we've come to a place where we're, so don't forget the hashtag, feel free to keep engaging after today's presentation. And also, if you're interested in reading the full report, we have an executive summary. We have a lovely video that summarizes the key findings if you want to send it out to faculty to share and get people involved and interested in this topic. The full data set is public access and it's available. All of that is available on our website, projectinfolit.org/news_study. So if you're interested in reading that, or you can just go to projectinfolit.org and we have it all over our website. So thank you very much for coming and listening. We have a couple questions. I know that there's one on Twitter that I actually want to know the answer to because I'm not sure. Margie, do you know, did we record the difference between a student accessing a news article directly from the publication's website versus clicking the same link on social media? Because it's all self-report, right?
Yeah, it's all self-report. We ask students those as different pathways to news. So are you accessing the newspaper's online site? We did have a lot of comments that basically wanted to clarify for us that when they said they were using social media for news, it was because they were following the New York Times on Twitter or on Facebook, or they were following particular journalists. So students called us on the question. as being slightly ambiguous in terms of the way that they interacted with news. So they said, well, I'm not just getting it from anybody on Facebook. I'm getting it from the New York Times Facebook page. So they're seeing that dual nature, and I think a lot of them understand it. I think where it gets tricky is when it's a New York Times story, but it's been reposted and reposted and reposted, and it's kind of lost its identifying marks and flags. And so people aren't always aware of what they're reading in these online environments and where it came from. And we did have a response on the students saying, when we asked about how they trust news, is that if they can't tell where it came from, they can't trust it. And the numbers for that were quite high. So I think in answer to the question, no, we didn't ask that, but we do have data that points to students understanding that there's a difference in that it matters where the content comes from. So long answer to a short question. Other questions? Oh, do you have suggestions for moving beyond crap? Yes.
That's a big question. I don't know how you introduce concepts, Margie, but I like to start with what students are already doing. So I start with kind of a poll of saying, here's an article. How would you use it? Would you use it? Is this important? And then we can kind of talk. A lot of times what I'll start off with is showing them a native advertising and see if they can figure that out based on some context clues. And then we can actually start talking about what those context clues are and what you can do to identify it. But I don't have a great answer other than starting to think about crap is not always sufficient in evaluating the sources that students are coming across. So I'm just starting to think about what that means to my instruction.
There was a great piece a couple of years ago, and I think I saw the Twitter from Kevin Sieber. If he's in the audience, hello. But it was something to the effect that if you ran crap against a piece by Trump, it would actually pass because he had the authority to speak about Trump, and so I think it's a very blunt instrument, and I think, and we allude to this in the report, it's an example of what we were seeing in that graph about academic use is using the container rather than the content for evaluation. So evaluating by container, does it have .edu? Is it in a peer-reviewed source? Rather than teaching strategies for evaluation by content. I like that I'm vain acronym. If you could spell that out, the person who just posted that, Kim, that'd be great. But I think one of the things that we need to think about is to move beyond evaluating by container. It's a very simple thing. It's easy for students to grasp, but it's a pretty blunt tool. And it doesn't help them when content morphs and when containers change. I think one of the things that occurred to me during this is how hard it is for students to actually see the analog components of some of the things that we talk about. As more and more of the electronic journals are online, they're not seeing what a physical academic journal looks like. The same with newspapers. I was in New York. Apart from the kiosks, it's very difficult to get a newspaper in New York. The drugstores didn't carry them, Barnes and Noble didn't carry them, the grocery stores didn't have them. So students may not be understanding things because they don't have that base analog. You talked about the news story on the front page versus on the end, right? And students don't see that. Hello?
Someone asked, let's see, someone said, do we define what news is? So in the report, let's see, can I pull up what we used as the definition for news? Let's see. We defined news to study participants just generally as events happening all around the world. We noted that news is more widely available to us than ever before. And let's see, I think that's, we kind of wanted to make it as broad as possible, so that kind of students could define news on their own and kind of apply how they're already viewing information as news. If it's something that we missed in our definition, we wanted to make sure to make it broad. So we included in our methodology section of the full report, how kind of we came up with that definition, why we based it on that, but there is a definition. And then the other question was about print newspapers. Did you mean the actual print copy? That was the way the question was framed, was physical, like a physical source, and that 33% said they still read it. So I don't know how they access it, if they have subscriptions, or if they're going to the library and reading the physical copy, or how they're accessing it. But yeah, they said physical sources, the print newspapers.
Okay, I'm just answering a couple of questions in text on Twitter on PIL News. So if I look a little distracted, that's what I'm doing.
And Kim defined I'm vain as independent, multiple, verify, authoritative, informed, named. And Allison corrected me. I said methodology instead of methods. That's what I meant, methods. What about differentiation between news as event and analysis? In terms of how we defined it, or Margie, do you have a comment on that?
I think if you look at the topics, the topics that the students followed, the ones that they followed most, the traffic and weather, were some of those single event, and probably the politics, and certainly in the comments, what they referred to were more news as event. Partly due to the timing of our study, the talks with North Korea came up fairly frequently in the comments. So I think we don't have direct data on that, but my suspicion would be that students think of news as reporting about the event in general. Just again, from the comments and from the interview data.
So someone asked about what titles they read. So we didn't get titles and differentiate between how they were accessing them between physical and online, but we have some information. So let's see. I think this was
question 5.
Right.
Because the order of the questions is kind of tattooed on my soul. We don't have that graph in the
slides, but it's in the final report.
Yeah.
The breakdown, and I think we break it down by gender, and how and who was accessing different sources more frequently. I think that was in like a sidebar.
So we have that for gender on what students were actually tweeting and retweeting and what our background data was. And so there were differences in that. We also asked if you could choose only one news source, what would you choose? I don't have that number handy. Let me have a look. No, sorry. We do report some of that data, and if you send an email to one of us, I think our emails are at the top of the slide, the first slides, but we can also I'll put mine in. It may be a couple of days before I get back to you because I'm traveling, but I can send you that data. If I can remember my email, here we go.
And I think Margot pointed a question about someone said would recommend a good source for news evaluation strategies. Lori shared the Breaking News Consumers Handbook, which is really useful. Pointer's News has a ton of great resources. Trying to think of other places that we discussed.
Mike Caulfield's fact-checking handbook. Let me just see. I'll put the link in. Yeah, his web literacy for student fact checkers is very good as well, and it's quick. It's rapid.
And in the report, we mentioned First Draft, which works on verification and misinformation. So that might be another good resource.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do the same thing, Elizabeth. I like to put evaluation strategies next to the resources in LibGuides, so that, and that's the joy of LibGuides, that you can do that right there.
Yeah. We're getting the hook, I think, from Margot Conahan.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you guys all so much for joining us. This was fun.
Thank you very much. It's been a really fast hour. Bye.